and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the next video on theoretical Rook endgames. For today, we have the famous 4 versus 3, which is probably the one to come most likely out of all of the ones which we've already covered on this channel. So what I did for this video as well was to go through the fantastic book of Sam Shankland on Rook endgames. I will again put a link to the book into the video description down below. Make sure to check it out. I did already mention this in the previous Rook endgame videos. If you want to level up your Rook endgame skills, I think it's a fantastic book to study because all of the important Rook endgames are really analyzed nicely there with many rules which you can follow and easily put the knowledge into practice as well. Now to the 4 versus 3. It is, from my experience, the one which is very likely to come in over the board games. I did already have it in many games myself as well. And of course, in almost all of the cases, it is a draw with good play from black, but there are quite a few ways to bungle the draw from the black side and quite a few ways from white's perspective as well to ask black some uncomfortable questions. Now, the first game which we are seeing right here is quite a famous one between Jeroen Piket with white pieces against none other than Garry Kasparov from the year 2000. And I did already post this game on YouTube under the community section, and I was asking you guys, how can black make a draw here? Keep in mind, Kasparov actually lost this game from the black side. Now, I do think it was an internet game with a 60-minute time control, so that might have played a role as well. But still, you wouldn't expect Kasparov to lose an endgame like this. And in this specific structure, it is quite a favorable one for black, I would say. It would be even better for black if this pawn is on h3 already, because then the white king cannot even enter on the king side like this, which is one of the main winning ideas here for white. And there is one nice rule to remember here from the black side. Now, Kasparov started with move rook d3, which is not a mistake itself, but it is already a small step into the wrong direction. Now, the best way to draw here with black is just to wait with the rook on the 7th rank to avoid white from getting rook c7. And after rook d7, if white attempts to come in with a king to h4, then what you should do is to go king h6 to stop white from getting king g5. Because once king g5 comes, then it could be quite tricky. Like if black does not do anything whatsoever, white does have some ideas. Like just for example, they could try to put the rook to f6 and then maybe push e6. Obviously, black still has some counter chances, like with ideas like rook b2, but now already you need to be a bit worried about ideas like rook c7, for example, threatening e6. So by far the easiest thing to remember is just to go king h6 here. And yeah, then just wait with the rook on the 7th rank, and it's not really easy how white can now make any significant progress. If white pushes h3 with the idea of g4, then obviously we should take. This was another rule which was formulated by Shankland, which was that whenever you can trade pawns without weakening your own structure, you should usually go for it, which I thought was quite a nice way of putting it as well. So after g4, black should take and then go all the way to the back, rook a1, because now the king is not shielded by any white pawns anymore, which means that black can now start checking on the last rank, and now it should be quite an easy draw. So Kasparov went rook d3, and after king h3, now he actually made a mistake already with rook e3. Now it is already a losing position. Instead, again, rook d7 would have been a draw, and after king h4, again, this idea of going king h6 is the easiest way for black to hold the game. After rook e3, both players actually made some mistakes here. Piket should have started with rook c7 first and then king h4 instead, just to see how the game went and how Kasparov then lost. It was still a draw here if you would have gone back with the rook, because now after rook c7 there is still the move rook b5, which is still kind of barely holding a draw again, like we've seen before, but it is already not optimal to even allow this for black, because this rook to the 7th rank and king h6 is by far an easier way to hold the game. After Kasparov's move, rook e1, now it was too late, and Piket found the move rook c7, and now just also quite instructive to know how white is actually winning this. Because after rook e2, it might still be not so obvious how white can make progress. Obviously, you could think about going h3, g4, but that's actually not the right winning plan. Instead, white should go for the move rook e7 here, with the idea to play e6 next. And if black waits with a move like rook e1, for example, then e6 is winning anyway, with the idea that after rook takes e6, you can take. Now the only winning move for white is actually the move h3. With the idea that this pawn endgame now is lost after king f7, king h6, and after king f6 now you have the move g4, which is also why it's important to play h3 and not h4, because if h4 then king f7, now king f6, and now white does not have the move g4, and now it would just be a draw. So the game concluded like this. Kasparov went rook a2, but now f5 is the right way to win. G takes f5 and now e6. Keep in mind e6 immediately would be a mistake, because then black could have the move rook a5 check, and if king h4 then king f6. And this is, okay, now in this position even taking with the pawn is not possible because the rook is hanging, but even if the rook is here on b7, for example, this is often a drawing mechanism that you can go king f6, and then if the pawn takes, then you could still even go back king g7, when the extra pawn on f7 is often not really something that's useful for white. But here obviously it anyway doesn't work, and if rook takes f7, then king takes e6 would make an easy draw for black. All right, so let's move on to the next example, which I have for you, which is just a brief excerpt of the game between Giri and Hikaru Nakamura, just for one idea, which I thought was worth highlighting, in the sense of how white can try to maximize his winning chances. This is some position which you can often get. The pawns are still kind of on the, more or less on the starting positions, and on the starting squares. And what white should try to achieve in this 4 versus 3 is to try to gain as much space with the pawns as possible. And what black would always like to achieve is to play the move h5. Like we've seen in the previous example, black always wants to have the structure f7, g6, h5. This is usually considered to be the best for black, which is why in a position like this, it is very much in white's favor to play the move rook b5. Now, this is the type of position where the engine is not any help for you whatsoever, because any move is triple zeros anyway. But the move rook b5, from a practical standpoint, is by far the best way to try something here with white, because you want to go g4 next and then stop black from getting this g6, h5 setup. I guess you could also start with the move g4 in this specific position, but now already you would need to keep in mind the move h5 for black. Or let's say this pawn is on g6 already. Let's just say we have a position like this. Then black already could play the move rook a5 himself and then play h5. So this is why in a position like this, always keep in mind the idea of putting the rook to the 5th rank. In the game, still, Hikaru was able to make a fairly easy draw, but just to show here, if white gets this, at least it is kind of a small success, and then the play could develop something like this, for example, and at some point white could be thinking of pushing h5, after which it is actually also important for black to know, going into this structure, in my opinion, is quite risky. There are quite a few games here where black is actually losing this. It was also covered in a lot of depth in Gelfand's book on heavy piece endgames, if I'm not mixing things up now. And here white does have the winning plan, or possible winning plan, of advancing the pawns to the 5th rank and then pushing f6, which is actually quite difficult for black to stop. And then the f7 pawn is often weak. White often has ideas to break through with e6 as well. So going to this, in my opinion, is quite risky. So here in this specific position after h5, I think that black should go g5, and here it should be kind of an easy draw. And yeah, white could also try to move f4 here, but then black could start giving checks. So from my experience, it would also be quite useful here to just wait with the rook on the last rank once the king approaches, because then you're already ready to start giving checks from the last rank. Yeah, let's move on to the next example without any further ado, which was also, I will just mention this briefly, a game between Jeffrey Xiong and Sam Shankland. Let's start from this position. And here black has the perfect setup, and Sam was able to make a draw fairly easily. Also keep in mind that the pawn is here on h3, which is, I would also say, a small improvement for black actually, because white does not have this Piket Kasparov plan of putting f4, e4, and e5, and then running possibly with the king over here, which anyway is not such a dangerous plan if we know how to react, but still having the pawn on h3 is not necessarily a benefit for white. Of course, white does have the idea to push g4 at some point, which is also what happened in the game here. And now, again, Shankland's nice sentence of saying we accept any trades that don't split our pawns, which we should always keep in mind in this specific endgame. And that's why black should take. And Sam was able to make a fairly easy draw here. Now we even have a 3 versus 2, which is even a little bit easier. The only thing was here, which I thought was also worth mentioning, as Shankland pointed out here after the move f4. It's good for black not to play f5. It is still a draw here, but it's asking for trouble, because after white goes back king f3, at some point black should maybe even take on g4, and then this structure could be a little bit more risky than just keeping the structure intact like this. So that's why Shankland played the move rook a1, which I also think is the easiest way to hold the position. And this was a nice final trap after the move f5 here. The pawn on g4 is hanging, but it should not be captured, because now after f6, black is actually losing, because the d7 pawn is not it's not able to protect it anymore. That's why black should just take on f5, and then this position 2 versus 1 is kind of an easy draw, and Shankland was able to hold it quite comfortably. Yeah, so the next position, now we have 2 positions which we should keep in mind. This is one structure which offers very good winning chances for white, unless the only way for black to hold this is actually if he has the king on h7 and his rook behind this pawn. Because white's winning plan in this position is to push e5, and after black takes on e5, then white wants to take back with a pawn. And then this passed pawn on the e file will usually decide the game. And the next structure, which is winning for white, is this one. Again, of course, there are some exceptions where black could maybe be able to reach a draw with concrete play. For example, with f6, often it's possible to break the structure. But usually, if white gets this position with the king on f5, then it is winning. We're going to cover this in a second in a little bit more depth as well. Yeah, so now there is one example which I've again copied from from Sam's book with some of my own annotations as well, but this was quite an instructive one. So this was a game between Pavel Blehm and Igor Foygel from the year 2006, both grandmasters, and here white played the move h5. And this is already kind of a big success for white to get something like this, because now, as we have seen before, it is not so far away for white to actually achieve this winning structure of getting f4, e5, and coming with the king to f5. Now, according to Shankland, what is black's best defense here is to play the move f6 in this position. Sorry, just a second here. Yeah, now it's good. Just to avoid white from getting this push with e5 in completely. And now it's important that we just don't let the king to f5 unless we can get this structure with king on h7 and rook behind the pawn. But for example here, after king f4, king f7, if white goes king f5, there's even still the move rook a5 check. I've also liked that Shankland has analyzed this endgame, because actually it is not like a 100% guaranteed win. Still, white needs to find the right winning idea here, which is to go rook d1, threatening to go rook d7. So if black makes a waiting move, this is a nice transformation, and the pawn endgame is winning, because white is picking up all of the pawns. And if black plays king e7, white should actually go for the move rook d4. This is important, because now e6 does not work because of rook b5 check when white is losing the pawn on e6. And if king g6, there is still rook g5, which is also an important point. So that's why white wants to place the rook on e4 here, which looks like quite a passive square, but it's actually nicely protecting the e5 pawn as well as the g4 pawn, which is also important. And after rook b7, if black just waits, then e6. Rook b5 check, king g6, and now the pawn on g4 is protected. And in this position, it is actually a Zugzwang. And I think that it is even a mutual Zugzwang. So if it would be white to move, then the position could be very well a draw, even though maybe there's king g8, even though then g6 could be possible. But anyway, if black is to move, then he is in Zugzwang and he's losing, because if he's moving the rook somewhere, then we can capture on g7. And if he's moving the king, then the rook can come from the other side. Again, if e7 check, then we have another Zugzwang, but now it's white to move, and therefore here it is a draw, because if king g8, then again g6 makes a draw. So rook a4 is the right way to proceed, and if king e7, then you can give a check, pick up the pawn on g7, and next the pawn on h6 will fall. So this is easily winning for white. So nice to show also that this endgame is winning, but some care needs to be taken, and this plan of putting the rook to e4 is something which we can nicely remember. If white tries to move rook c5 here, then what you could maybe consider as well is a move like rook a3, even though that could be risky because sometimes white does have ideas like this. And if rook takes f3, then king g6. Even though here concretely you can probably manage to get this set up, because now after f4 you have the move rook f3. And just to explain again the idea of rook f3, now whenever white goes e5, which is probably the only serious winning attempt, then black can take, and now white cannot take back with the pawn because of the pin. So here the king would need to take, which now gives us a very simple draw with 3 versus 2. But also possible is the move g5 here, and if white takes, then we did split our pawns, but in this specific case, black has a pretty solid structure and the king is not able to come to f5, which then it would be very risky. But since the king is not able to come to f5 here, black has kind of a nice setup and it's not easy for white to make any progress. For example, if rook c6, then for example rook a4, pinning the pawn should secure the draw rather easily, or also move like rook a5, potentially even preparing to exchange another pair of pawns with h5 next. Yeah, but what happened in the game? Black played the move rook a3, which is already a small step into the wrong direction, and here white played the move king f4. According to Shankland, the best attempt for white would be to play the move rook c6 check, which I also tend to agree with, because now what black should do is already not so easy. I think that many players would automatically go for the move king e7, but now e5 is actually already winning, and now white gets this winning setup, which we've discussed before already, and there's no way for black to stop this plan of white putting the king to f5 and then advancing with f4 and getting the winning setup. Often what black wants to get is to play the move f6, but here it doesn't work concretely because the pawn reaches the e6 square, and in this specific case there is rook g8 and rook takes g7, rook g6, and here it's actually important that the rook is on e6, because there are some cases where this position can be a draw. For example, if the rook is not on the 6th rank now, then the rook is actually going to be trapped, because after rook g6 check, then black could go king f7. But here, in this specific case, white is winning because of g5, and the rook is now unfortunately placed on the 6th rank, which means that black cannot take on g5 because the rook is hanging. Yeah, just to show, for example, if white would go rook h7 here, then rook e5, and now this position is a draw, which is kind of funny, because white is up 2 pawns, even connected pawns, which almost always results in win. But here, the unfortunate placement of the rook allows black to hold a draw here. The best attempt for white is probably to try to get the f and h endgame, which we've covered in a separate video with g5 next, but with good defense, as we now know, this should result in a draw. So after rook c6 check, king d7 is holds by some miracle as well, as Shankland nicely put it, but the best is probably to just go king e5, stopping king f4 as well. And after rook c8, with actually the threat of rook e8 followed by e5, now black should go king f6 back. Important that if king e6, there's rook e8 check, and king f6 would put the king into a lot of trouble after e5. And if king d7, then there's rook g8, winning the pawn. So king f6 is another important move. And after rook c7, then black can just wait. For example, here, if rook e8, then I assume that black... Actually, not so entirely easy, because after rook a5, then there could be the move king f4. Maybe I'm still in time to hold like this with g5 and then to take back with a king. That is maybe still possible here concretely, because white does not have e5, f4 already. But anyway, in the game, king f4 was played. It's not like rook c6 was winning, because black still had some ideas, but it is a nice practical attempt, since king e7, e5 is already losing. And yeah, this position we will see in a second, how white is exactly winning there. So after king f4, black played the move rook a8. Instead, rook a6 would have been correct to stop white from getting a check on c6. But black played rook a8, now rook c5, another small mistake, rook c6 check again would be the correct move, preparing e5. But now white finally took the chance and played the move rook c6 check. Which now brings us to this position which we've had in the beginning. Now, this position, as I've already said, is winning for white, but it's still not entirely easy. The only thing which is easy if black does not see our plan, which is to go rook c8 followed by rook g8, just picking up the pawn on g7. So if black makes a passing move like rook b7, then this should be easily winning. Rook g8. Black can set up a nice final trap here because rook takes g7 is actually now a big problem for white because the rook is going to be lost. But instead, white can start with g5 and only on the next move take on g7, and then it is easily winning. Now in the game rook b4 was played, which we are going to check out in the very end. Black's best defense is to go rook b8 in this position to stop the plan of rook c8 followed by rook g8. And this is another position which I actually posted in the YouTube community section, and I was asking how can white win here, and many of you guys were actually able to find the right winning plan, which, to be fair, I was a little bit surprised because I have never seen this position before studying Shankland's book, and I think it's quite nice to know this position. Because it's still not entirely easy how to break through. Some people have already also suggested to immediately break through with g5, but this is not the right winning way, because now black can take and now go rook b1. And now black is ready to check from behind. Still white can give a check and go g6, but now black has rook f1 check, another check, and another check. And we will see in a second from the main line why we should not allow this and how we can not allow this as well. Because now it is a draw after king e3, black can take and go rook g1, and black is holding a draw here. Yeah, rook c7 check is not a mistake itself here. You can try this because also it sets up a small trap. If black goes king e8, then white is winning immediately with e6, f takes e6, and then king g6. But black can go king f8, and now again we have to find the right winning idea, which is actually the paradoxical move rook c1 in this position. Looks very passive, but the idea is to prepare g5 without allowing black to get the rook to the first rank himself. Black anyway needs to stay passive because whenever he moves the rook, we will get rook c8 followed by rook g8, which is winning as we've seen earlier. And if black waits, now we want to play g5. And if he takes, now we see that the black rook cannot go to the first rank. Wow, now we've learned something. And if black waits passively, then rook c7 check, king f8 followed by g6 is winning because the rook is very passive, and also king e6 can come next. Also winning plan is just rook f7 check followed by advancing the e-pawn. This is hopelessly lost for black. And if black attempts to give checks from behind, now we see a huge difference, which is that the rook is on a2. And the big difference here is that after giving 2 checks, now king f4, keep in mind king f3 would be a mistake because the e5 pawn is hanging. King f4, and now if rook f2 check, now we have to move king e3. And now all of a sudden the rook is attacked, which was not the case if black's rook was on the first rank. Yeah, also this is winning if black takes. Now king e4, again king e3 would be a mistake because after rook g2 it is drawn. But after king e4, now if rook g2 there's king f5 and the king will come to e6. If rook f2 check, and then it is easily winning. So what happened in the game was black played rook b4, and now white easily got this position, and white quickly won. Also here I would like to mention again this trap that if black goes rook b6 we should not take because then the rook is going to get trapped, but what we can do here is again to go for g5 and then take on g7 on the next move. Yeah, that was another very instructive example. Now that was another position which I wanted to show you, which is if we get this position but we don't have the king on f5 just yet. And it's actually not so easy to get it there. If you would choose the most logical plan, king e3 with the idea of rook d3 followed by rook d4 next, it doesn't spoil anything yet, but rook d3, rook d4 is not the right plan. Because if black waits with rook c4 and white now goes rook d3, now it is a draw because now black can play the move f6. And if rook d4, rook c6 important, king e4, now black can take, and if it is white to move now and white gets king f5, it's lost again. But since it is black to move, black has to move king e6, and now the players can basically shake hands because white can wait on the 4th rank, but whenever he goes there, then black can just give a check and then just return to c6, so there's no way to make any progress for white in this position anymore. Yeah, rook b7 check here, and rook b6, yeah, just goes back to the beginning. And f5 check, this is also nice. This only works with the king on f3, which is going to bring us back to the main line, because the difference here is if the king is on e3 and not on f3, now the g4 pawn is not protected, and now black can take on g4. This is very important for us to remember as well. So the right winning method is to give a check on b7. Now, if king e6 comes, then we have the move f5. And now the king is on f3, so now white is winning because we are going to pick up the pawn on g7 next, and the g4 pawn is protected. For example, if rook f4 check, just king g3 followed by rook takes g7, and if black gives checks from the side, the king can just run over here and then take on g7. It looks still not so easy for white to actually win this, but I did go a little bit deeper here with the computer, and it doesn't seem that difficult. You can just take on g7, go rook g6, and at some point the king is going to be able to run back to the king side. Also, king e8 does not put up a lot of resistance because of the move e6, which is winning basically by force. So the move king f8 should be tried from black, and now the good move for white, which we should remember, is the move rook d7. Now that the king is not on e7 anymore, now is the time when we want to go for this plan of king e3 followed by rook d4. If black waits, then king e3. Also keep in mind that king e8 still runs into problem of e6. In this position, we can even go for rook d4. But what I wanted to say was that if king e8 here, then white has the move e6 winning easily. So, for example, rook a4, rook d4, and then now it would be too late for black to go f6, because then already the king is on f5, and if black takes, of course, white takes with the pawn, which brings us back to one position which we've already covered earlier. And that was it from the 4 versus 3 endgame, from the 4 versus 3 rook endgame. I hope that it was useful for you guys. I think that this endgame is very, very important for us to study. Even myself as a grandmaster, it was very useful for me to revisit some of the knowledge and even advance some of my knowledge. Like, for example, this endgame is something I never really looked at before. And it's nice to know which type of position is winning, what is the winning plan there, and how you can avoid it from the black side as well. If you have any more endgames which you would like me to cover, let me know in the comment section down below. We did already cover quite a few rook endgames. You can check out the playlist where this video is in as well, with all of the theoretical rook endgames which we have covered on this channel already. Apart from that, thank you guys for watching. If you want to support me, check out the video description down below with all of my different courses, as well as my other social media. And that was it for today. I will see you guys soon.